Potem, ko smo dopoldne slišali, kako naj bi sanirali javne finance, kako naj bi razdolžili slovensko gospodarstvo, kako naj bi izboljšali slovenski bančni sistem ter povečali število zaposlenih, bomo skušali v prihodnji uri in pol z gosti na današnji okrogli mizi vse te tri teme nekako zaokrožiti in jih seveda hkrati nadgraditi z odgovori ključnimi za našo državo, z odgovori ključnimi za Slovenijo. Dovolite, da najprej predstavim goste, ki bodo sodelovali v današnji okrogli mizi. Na moji skrajni levi gospod Mojmir Mrak z Ljubljanske ekonomske fakultete, sledi gospod István Pal Székely iz Evropske komisije, pa gospod Dirk Jan Kraan iz Mednarodnega denarnega sklada, na moji desni pa gospa Piritta Sorsa iz Organizacije za ekonomsko sodelovanje in razvoj, gospod Bojan Marković iz Evropske banke za obnovo in razvoj in naš gostitelj gospod Boštjan Vasle iz Urada za makroekonomske analize in razvoj. Pa začnimo morda kar pri vas, gospod Vasle. Pred dobrim letom dni smo slišali izjavo takratne ministrice vlade, ki je komajda pričela svoj mandat, gospe Alenke Bratušek, ki kot vemo je danes v odstopu. Ona je takrat dejala, ne potrebujemo denarja, vse kar potrebuje Slovenija je čas. Po letu in pol bi lahko rekli, da časa nimamo več, čas smo bolj ali manj zapravili, vse kar potrebujemo pa je denar oziroma kapital. Gospod Vasle, bi se lahko s tem strinjali?
Mislim, da smo v tem trenutku v Sloveniji v obdobju, ko sta obe dobrini, ki ste omenili, tako čas kot denar, nam na razpolago v zelo skromnem obsegu. Kar se tiče časa, smo v Sloveniji zamudili, celo če se primerjamo z nekaterimi drugimi evropskimi državami, tisti pravi trenutek, da bi se uspešno in hitro odzvali na krizo, tako da čas je potekal, zdaj smo res v tistem skrajnem roku, ko lahko še poskušamo narediti nekatere stvari, ki so v druge države že. Kar se tiče pa denarja, pa prav tako Slovenija je v času krize močno povečala svojo zadolžitev. Pred časom smo imeli tudi velike težave do dostopa na tuje trge, te so se ublažile, pa vseeno mislim, da je ključni izziv, da tako s časom kot s denarjem v naslednjih v času, ki pred nami ravnamo zelo skrbno, zelo racionalno in da poskušamo najti take rešitve, ki nam bodo ob pomanjkanju obeh dobrin pomagale na poti k hitrejšemu okrevanju.
Gospod Székely, lani jeseni, ko je bila naša država na nek način na prelomnici, ali bomo morali zaprositi mednarodno pomoč v obliki tako imenovane zloglasne trojke ali ne, in se je potem razpletlo pač na nek način v korist, če temu lahko tako rečemo. Ste dejali kot potencialni član te trojke, da Slovenija potrebuje, da nujno potrebuje ambiciozne reforme. Od tega je sedaj minilo, lahko rečemo več kot pol leta, smo uspeli te ambiciozne reforme, ki ste jih imeli vi takrat v mislih, vsaj delno izpolniti?
Better. So I believe Slovenia made important progress in, I would say, core areas, and should be proud of this because this was the first country that did it on its own and went all the way through. And not only that, the country conducted a very thorough asset quality review and stress test of basically the entire system, but it also fully recapitalized those banks that needed recapitalization. And now we have the NKBM already out for a tender. So I think a long road had been covered. And the important thing at this stage is to continue along the road that Slovenia itself set for the country. And in this respect, the most important thing at this stage is to make sure that those companies that had those bad loans that created the problem, that those companies are actually restructured and the viable parts of those companies are strengthened so that they can grow and create jobs. So that requires both the BMC or DUTP to focus on the workout and restructuring, but also the banks. As was pointed out in the excellent presentation in the morning, that a large part of those problem loans are still with the banks. So it's very important that the banks themselves have a new attitude vis-à-vis their clients. And the essence and importance of this attitude is to think about the client, the company, what that company needs, and what is the custom-tailored solution to that company so that the company can get stronger, survive, and grow. And that requires a new attitude on the part of the bankers, and it requires a new attitude on the part of the companies and the managers. But let me say that we hear a lot about bad news from this country. Actually, there are also good news coming, and I think it would be important to pay attention to this. So, for example, the very innovative scheme through which Gorenje could actually, through a market mechanism, carry out a debt equity swap, I think is something which is really, I think, a major step forward for many reasons. Number one, because it was a market-based solution, and I think the future is to find market-based solutions. Sometimes the government has to step in, but the best is if the market finds the solution.
O tem razdolževanju gospodarstva bomo še govorili veliko. Jaz bi vsekakor ostala še za kakšno minutko pri vas, gospod Székely. Zanimivo se mi je zdelo, da Evropska komisija je v svojih priporočilih za Slovenijo napisala prav konkretne številke, bistveno več konkretnih številk, bistveno več konkretnih rokov, kot recimo v priporočilih za kakšno izmed ostalih držav. Zakaj je temu tako, nezaupanje do Slovenije?
First of all, let me suggest that this is not related to Slovenia per se in the sense of, having anything special for this country. The European semester and the underlying processes, in this case the most important one being the macroeconomic imbalances procedure, where Slovenia was found to be one of the 3 countries that has excessive imbalance. In fact, the only country which is in that category for the 2nd year. And once a country is kind of diagnosed to be in that group, it's natural that we expect determined action. And this was the case when last year Spain and Slovenia was in that group, and this is the case this year when Italy, Croatia and Slovenia are in this group. So this is, in a way, for this group, it is natural to have much more specific country-specific recommendations and some important deadlines. The second important point in this regard is that all these deadlines are based on what Slovenia planned to do. So we're only holding the mirror to the country. And this is basically just a kind of a credibility-enhancing device to say to the outside world that Slovenia is determined, these are their plans, and we as a European Commission, or the recommendation is not from the Commission, the recommendation is from the Council, so from your fellow member states, would like to see this done because those who make the decision believe this is the right thing to do. So I think one should a little bit have a different look at this process. This process is there to help countries to implement their own plans.
Če ostanemo še malce v preteklosti, ki se seveda navezuje na sedanjost, gospod Mrak. Ko smo v Sloveniji se začeli sanacijo bančnega sistema in inicirali kar 3,4 milijarde evrov, ste vi takrat dejali, da je to točka preloma. Da če nas ta enormna številka ne bo streznila, potem stvari ne bodo šle v pravo smer. Kako zdaj vi vidite, ko je zdaj že nekaj časa od takrat minilo, je bila streznitev prava ali je bila morda samo delna?
Jaz mislim, da streznitve sploh ni bilo. Jaz moram reči, da res takrat, ko je prihajalo do tega v jeseni, in jaz mislim, da imamo danes izredno dobro priliko, da tudi mogoče kakšne stvari razčistimo. Za mene je bilo izrazito zanimivo, imamo tukaj predstavnika in Mednarodnega denarnega sklada in Evropske komisije, da so bile takratne novembrske ocene in artikel for misije in potem tudi komisije, jaz bi rekel relativno pozitivne in moramo vedeti, saj po moji oceni je bil to tisti ključni razlog, zaradi katerih je potem prišlo do percepcije na trgih, da Slovenija dejansko nekaj dela, ne, dejansko se tudi je nekaj dogajalo, končno v trenutku, dokler smo imeli pištolo na glavi, ne, in ta glavna pištola je bila takrat vezana na bančni sektor, je dejansko tista stvar šla naprej. In to, kar sem jaz takrat govoril je, in mislim, da je to še danes, ne, da je škoda, da tistega trenutka, ne, ko smo mi v to sanacijo bank šli z velikim, bi rekel, vložkom, da je bila to prilika, ne, kjer sem jaz upal in tudi končno govoril to predtem, ko se je zgodilo, ne, da je bilo fajn, da bi se takrat smeli še za kakšne druge resne stvari. Ne. In tukaj bom kar zelo odprt. Ne. Koalicijska pogodba februarska, ne, je zelo jasno pokazala, da ni popolnoma nobene ambicije iti po tej poti. Tako da po svoje je fajn, da imamo zdaj te predčasne rešitve oziroma predčasne volitve, ne, ker preprosto ne bomo izgubili let pa pol, ampak bo imela nova vlada, bi rekel, vsaj možnost, da v te stvari gre. A bo šla ali ne, to je zdaj druga stvar, ampak bomo videli. Če jih ne bi imeli, potem vsaj po tistem, kar je bilo v koalicijski pogodbi napisano, se ne bi dogajalo še naslednjo leto nič na teh strukturnih reformah. Jasno, nadaljevalo bi se to, kar se dogaja z bankami, ne, ampak drugih stvari pa, kot smo videli, ne. Tako da zanimivo bi bilo res slišati nek komentar na to. Moja nekak percepcija je, ne, in upam, da je narobe, da je bila tista ocena takrat jeseni, ne, relativno pozitivna, pa ne vem zakaj, čisto dobro. Zlasti zato, ker smo slišali v juniju zelo, bi rekel, kritične stvari, da Slovenija rabi resne stvari na odhodkovni strani javnih financ. Ne. Jeseni, zanimivo, v fondovem poročilu je bilo to relativno blago napisano. Ne. In zdaj 3 mesece kasneje imamo zopet podobno zgodbo. Ne. Jasno, jaz mislim, da Slovenija dejansko potrebuje, kar se tiče javnih financ, predvsem stvari na odhodkovni strani. Predvsem, žal. Ne.
Tudi o tem bomo še govorili. Morda še bi bilo zanimivo slišati, kako vidijo te zadeve, to streznitev v narekovaju od zunaj, gospod Marković. Kako vi vidite, kako se je Slovenija potem, ko smo v bistvu šli v to sanacijo bančnega sistema, kakšni so bili naši ukrepi oziroma koraki, so bili dovolj prepričljivi, kako to vidite vi od zunaj?
Well, the view from the outside is that we definitely see some improvements relative to where we were a year ago, and market recognized that. We had a pretty convincing AQR exercise. We had a list of 15 companies lined up for privatization. A list of 15 companies lined up for privatization. We had amendments in insolvency law in December, which actually were there to ease and make more efficient the restructuring procedure. And we also had the foundation of the DUTB, or BAMC, which was formed to actually conduct the corporate restructuring. Market recognized that. I mean, just to remind you, before these steps, country risk premium of Slovenia, so the cost of funding, was much higher than Croatian or Hungarian. After that, country risk premium almost halved. But of course, I mean, that's one of the reasons why EBRD decided to reopen the office. This reform momentum that we saw, plus the invitation of the government, meant that we actually came here in February, reopened our office in order to intensify our presence here and our investments here. But speaking about the bank recapitalization, there are maybe 2 or 3 important things to note here. First, bank balance sheets, weak bank balance sheets, were a reflection of weak corporate balance sheets. So the important thing here is the corporate restructuring, which doesn't happen overnight. Recapitalizing banks was not only bailing out banks, it was giving a breathing space to conduct a proper corporate restructuring. Corporate restructuring is not easy. One has to identify which corporates are viable, which are not. One shouldn't spend too much time on non-viable corporates. They should be orderly wind down. One should spend a lot of time to restructure viable corporates. So the success in this respect will be crucial. It's the corporate restructuring which will be make it or break it. The second important thing is, well, the Slovenian government did a pretty sizable injection into the banking sector, but the debt now is close to 70%. So this is one, well, 80%. I don't want to say only, but yeah, 80%, right, sorry. But this is one chance we have. We shouldn't waste this chance. We will hardly have another chance. So let's do something to use properly this chance. So my message is really we should keep doing what we are doing, what the reform program envisaged, but we should do it faster, and we should definitely not backtrack on reforms.
Gospa Sorsa, kako bi vi ocenili, kolikšna je verjetnost, da Slovenija kljub sanaciji bank ne bo uspela sama, da bo na nek način, vemo, zdaj trojka ni več v igri na nek način, ampak da bo morala zaprositi za nekakšno pomoč mednarodnih institucij. Vemo, zdaj donos na slovenske obveznice je padel, znaša tam okoli 3%, pa vendarle. Zagotovil verjetno o tem, da smo že na varni strani, ni. Katera so po vašem tista tveganja, ki so na nek način nas najbolj ogrožajo, če lahko tako rečemo?
Well, here we can look at the public sector and the private sector. So I do believe that Slovenia can get out of the crisis without, if we talk about IMF or Troika help, because they are reforming the public finances, and we saw all the projections that the debt will start declining. But one other area where I do think Slovenia may need external help is the private sector. Because there's been a lot of talk about the public companies, the still very dominant role of the public sector in the economy. And under current projections, if you look at what economists call the potential output, we are in totally different world than before the crisis. There it was maybe 3%, now we are back to 0 or maximum 1%, depends whose forecast you take. And this is the new reality, the new normal that some economists talk. And to get this potential output up, you need also fresh investments. You need not only to employ more people, but you need fresh investments. And if we look around, the public sector is completely squeezed, you won't get capital from there. What about the private sector? It's completely leveraged. Who's going to invest from the private sector into new activities or even reinforce the current ones? So then we get to the sensitive issues of either privatizations or foreign investment. But in a way, they can be a big benefit in boosting this potential growth and creating jobs and helping Slovenia maintain sort of the social model. But I'd say that you need external help, but not from the public side, but from the private side.
Tudi o privatizaciji, tako kot o razdolževanju gospodarstva bomo še govorili. Jaz bi imela še vprašanje, da zaokrožimo tale prvi krog za gospoda Kraana, in sicer z vidika javnih financ. Javni dolg, kot smo slišali, 80% se nam bliža, javnofinančni primanjkljaj v letošnjem prvem četrtletju čez 5%, 5,5%, načrti so pa smeli. Načrti so, prihodnje leto Slovenija naj bi znižala javnofinančni primanjkljaj pod 3%. Je sploh to realno? Oziroma, kakšne so tveganja, kakšne so sankcije, če tega ne bomo uspeli narediti, gospod Kraan?
Yeah, you're talking about the system of public financial management in Slovenia. The government is very ambitious, and rightly so, and I do think that the targets that have been set by the current government, but that will have to be reconsidered by the new government, are realistic. I mean, they are achievable, let's say that. But there are some weaknesses in the public financial management system of Slovenia that have to be addressed, and that the IMF has been reminding the government of for a couple of years, and that so far have not been addressed. I'm not saying that the whole system of public financial management is weak in Slovenia. I mean, there are very strong aspects of it. I mean, information is good, there's transparency, the budget execution is okay, the treasury system is basically sound. But there are some particular weaknesses, particularly in the sphere of budget preparation. And I mentioned two. One is that the government is not very good in saving, in retrenching expenditures, in cutting expenditures. And one reason is that there is no real top-down decision-making process. Countries that are better in saving have a decision moment in the beginning of the year, let's say before the summer, in March or April, in which they decide on the ceilings for the line ministries, and then they maintain these ceilings throughout budget preparation. There are even countries in Western Europe that have ceilings for more than 1 year, but I'm not talking about that. I'm now talking just about ceilings for 1 year. After the ceilings have been decided before the summer, the government should stick to them. And it should be this is a cultural matter also. I mean, the Ministry of Finance should insist on the maintenance of these ceilings, and he should also demand from the Prime Minister that he helps him in realizing this. Whereas in Slovenia, but not only in Slovenia, but other countries in the region as well, you see in principle this decision before the summer. I mean, this has now been a sort of common practice in almost all OECD countries and IMF countries, that there should be a so-called medium-term expenditure framework decided before the summer, and then this should have ceilings that are maintained. But what you see in many countries, including Slovenia, is that then in the budget preparation process after the summer, the ceilings are forgotten, and there is slippage, so that the budget as it is finally approved by the government and submitted to the parliament already has targets that deviate from the ceiling. So that's one weakness, I would say, that has to be addressed in the near future. And the second weakness I would like to mention here is that savings is a different matter than new expenditures. In this sense, the budget process is asymmetric. Line ministries in general have good incentives to come up with well-prepared initiatives for new spending, because they know that to the extent that the quality of their proposals for new initiatives is better policies, the chance is higher that they will be endorsed. For the same reason, ministries have no good incentives to come up with good proposals for consolidation, because they know that to the extent that, well, the same reason, to the extent that the proposal is better, the chance is higher that it will be adopted. And line ministries don't want retrenchments or cuts in their own budget. So if you want to generate good quality proposals for cuts, you have to do it outside the regular budget process. And this is practiced by a number of countries now, an increasing number of countries. So it's called spending review, and it is a way of preparing budget cuts outside the regular budget process. That's to say, the line ministries are involved, but they cannot, and they have to provide information, and they have to sit in the committees that prepare these proposals, but they cannot dominate the process. And I think this is a high priority for Slovenia if it wants to have more success in consolidation. It has to establish a spending review process, as now exists in many European countries, in order to realize this.
Gospod Kraan, ali bi pomagalo, če bi imeli fiskalno pravilo uzakonjeno? Kot vemo, ni bilo še 3/4 volje v državnem parlamentu, da bi bilo to zapisano. Bi bil to tisti garant, ki bi omogočil to, kar ste vi našteli?
Well, I mean, the IMF is in general in favor of fiscal rules, so I mean that's also important for Slovenia. But I think the budgetary discipline is in the first place a cultural thing. I mean, I see that that's important to put it in the law, and many countries are now putting it in the law, and that may be an additional factor that supports budgetary discipline. But I do think that it is in the first place a cultural thing, and that it is important that countries learn from each other. For instance, in the context of the EU, and the EU organizes peer review sessions in which countries listen to each other. I think that kind of thing is extremely important, and there are countries that have a very good budgetary discipline, and I think the basic thing there is a cultural matter, and that this cultural revolution, as it were, should take place in Slovenia as well.
Predlagam, da gremo sedaj drugi krog. Ta drugi krog bodo vprašanja, ki bodo seveda usmerjena bolj v prihodnost. Že čez nekaj dni Slovenijo čakajo predčasne parlamentarne volitve, na katerih bomo dobili, mislim, da zdaj pa že 4. vlado zapored v času krize. 3 zapored namreč niso uspele končati mandata. Gospod Székely, pred časom ste dejali, tako levi kot desni, ne glede na to, kdo bo dobil mandat na tokratnih volitvah, vsak bi se moral zavedati in bi moral natančno vedeti, katere reforme jih čakajo. Lahko osvežite.
Thank you. I think the reform path for the country has been set out by the country itself, and this is how the EU works, that we require countries to formulate their plans, that's the National Reform Program, and also the Stability Program, which is also there to promote those very important goals about medium-term budgetary planning and discipline. And this was discussed with us and the member states, and I think the major reforms are well crystallized. Number one, as I said before, that the workout of the bad loans should proceed with the company in mind, where there is a company that can be kind of safeguarded there and strengthened. The second very important area is to have a very well-defined relationship between the state and those companies that will remain state-owned. This is important so that the taxpayer gets a good, service and return from the company that it owns, but also because these are important part of the economy and society, so that they should perform their duties. So they need to be better managed, and there should be a kind of professional culture of managing this. That requires an institution, which is the state holding that has already been created. It's very important that this state holding behaves in a professional manner. It has a clear mandate from the political level, from the parliament, which assets are to be maintained as state-owned, which assets are to be disposed, and do both jobs professionally and based on the mandate from the political level. Once this relationship is well defined and you have a professional culture in these institutions, we will see major improvements in this regard. So this is, I think, another important area. Naturally, we should not forget about the fiscal consolidation. I think we had an excellent presentation by the Institute here, so I really have nothing to add. I think everything they said there is really right on the same, along the same lines that we would suggest and we think, not surprisingly, because we have very frequent interactions. Again, what is the important issue here? The important issue here is that as a result of the crisis and to some extent as a result of the banking rehabilitation, the current level of debt reached around 80%, which is a zone where countries can be very vulnerable. I mean, if you look around in the region, you have a few countries with this kind of debt level, and if you look into, how market behaved vis-a-vis these countries when there was some turbulence in the market, there was some, other developments in the world, these countries were the first one to feel the pressure from the market. So you want to be outside of this kind of danger zone. And in order to achieve that, you need exactly what the IMF representative described, a very clear long-term strategy and a very solid way and clear way of reaching the target. Let me mention in this regard that actually one of the country-specific recommendations are calling for exactly the kind of expenditure review that it was mentioned as a good practice. And Also because I think inside the country it's already well understood that the healthcare system is one area where you could do reforms that improve the service to the people, but it also reduces the cost of delivering that service. And we believe that there are potentially important areas and amounts that one could save. So what we suggested here is first let's get the facts, do an expenditure review in this, understand what and how in this sector the country spends, and then based on that you can have a good diagnosis for reforms that are long-lasting and in fact even improve things rather than just cutting without any underlying good analysis and strategy. I think for us at this stage these are the key areas. Of course we have a long list of recommendations. I don't want to go through all of this. I was very encouraged by the discussion on the labor market and understanding the importance of increasing in certain segments the flexibility, but at the same time not creating unnecessary artificial arbitrages to work out there. Thank you.
Jaz bi še malce ostala pri javnofinančni konsolidaciji. Gospod Mrak, kot smo rekli, predčasne parlamentarne volitve se bližajo, programi strank so bolj ali manj jasni, ampak nikjer, skoraj da v nobenem, ni zaslediti kakšnih napovedi o tem, da se bo javnofinančna konsolidacija, da se bo to uravnoteženje javnih financ delalo tudi z rezanjem na strani odhodkov. Skratka, vse je bolj na strani prihodkov v smislu, zdaj imamo gospodarsko rast, zdaj bodo tudi ostale stvari šle lažje, hitreje bomo zniževali dolg in tako naprej. Vi pa opozarjate, da bo treba tudi ne samo na strani prihodkov, kjer so stvari bolj ali manj zaradi zvišanja davkov omejene, kaj storiti tudi na strani odhodkov.
No, jaz moram se pridružujem temu, kar je bilo rečeno, da je v bistvu UMAR naredil, jaz lahko pač ta fiskalni del, imam pač neko bolj mnenje, se mi zdi, da je naredil zelo dobro analizo tega, kje smo in kako. Mislim, da zlasti ena zelo jasna lekcija je, če se spomnite tistega, mi v bistvu vlečemo ta deficit od leta 2009 naprej praktično nespremenjen, z izjemo jasno lanskega leta tega enkratnega efekta na banke. Ampak problem je, da mi redno v bistvu rabimo za približno milijardo več, po drugi strani se nam večajo obresti in nam jasno prostora za druge stvari zmanjkuje. Tako da jaz mislim, da kar se javnih financ tiče, bo potrebno iti v neko strategijo. Ena stvar je kratkoročno in tukaj jaz vidim predvsem leto 2015, drugo je pa potem, jaz ne bi rekel srednjeročno, ampak recimo 2016, 2017, niso vse stvari časovno enako pomembne. Vsi se lahko strinjamo, da Slovenija potrebuje ponovno revizijo, dopolnitev pokojninske reforme, ampak naj vlada se zdaj s tem ne ukvarja letos. Ne zato, da to ni pomembno, ampak ima po mojem drugih stvari na tem javnofinančnem področju za naslednje mesece bistveno več. Po mojem bo za vlado, kako narediti proračun za leto 2015 pod predpostavko, da se drži tega, kar je bilo obljubljeno. In mislim, da to bi moralo ostati tako, kot je bilo obljubljeno. Zdaj, če bojo kle začele vlade, karkoli že bo, kakršnekoli resnejše spremembe, potem bo ta problem kredibilnosti Slovenije še bolj trpel, pri čemer je bila ta kredibilnost Slovenije postavljena pod resne vprašaje že v preteklosti. Mislim, preteklosti, govorim zlasti v zadnjih mesecih. Poglejte, Slovenija je imela pred krizo en imidž, verjetno je bil tudi mečken neupravičen. Ene zelo, kako bi človek rekel, kredibilne države. Tisto, kar smo se odločili, smo naredili. Po drugi strani je pa potem zdaj s to krizo, z odlašanjem te konsolidacije, pa potem s tistimi neumnimi referendumi, ki smo jih imeli za stvari, za katere vsi točno vemo, da je treba jih narediti, je ta kredibilnost od neki pragmatičnosti Slovenije se, bi rekel, zelo zamajala. In jaz mislim, da bo od te nove vlade, pa kakršnakoli bo zelo pomembno, kakšen bo ta message glede kredibilnosti naprej. Jaz moram reči, jaz pa sem malo bolj kritičen do tehle priporočil Evropske komisije tokrat. Jaz sem jih šel gledati zelo natančno. Te priporočila so konceptualno drugačna kot za katerokoli drugo državo in strinjam se, Slovenija je ena od parih držav v tej proceduri excessive imbalances, ne, ampak tam noter so tudi stvari, kjer so datumi dane za stvari, ki pač, gledajte, lahko so dane, lahko jih pa ne bi bilo, ne. Tako da jaz imam percepcijo, moj občutek je, da gre dejansko za neko nezaupanje, ne. Bom zelo zadovoljen, če bomo slišali, da temu ni tako, ne. Namečken, se pravi, v bistvu kratkoročno, kako pride do teh pod 3% drugo leto, jaz jih ne vidim na prihodkovni strani, oziroma ne bi smel biti na prihodkovni strani. Kar se tiče sprememb davčnih stvari, po mojem so lahko samo usmerjene v kakšno spremembo strukture, to ja, ne pa povečanje davčne obremenitve. To jasno pomeni, da bo treba stvari narediti na odhodkovni strani, ne. Kle pa vemo, kakšen je manevrski prostor ob teh stvarih, kar se tiče obresti in drugega. Na srednji rok, kle pa jasno, potem prijo te stvari pokojninske, mislim, da ta diskusija okrog dolgoročnih, kje je Slovenija glede na javni dolg in tako naprej, jaz mislim, da si delamo mi večkrat prevelike iluzije okrog tega, koliko bo privatizacija prinesla k zmanjševanju javnega dolga. Jasno, tle imamo neke potencijale, Slovenija ima veliko še tega v primerjavi z drugimi državami, ampak gledajte, prodajamo po cenah, jasno, kakršne so danes, tako da ta potencijal, da bomo tle mi blazno zmanjšali, treba biti tle realističen. Mi moramo v bistvu te tekoče javne finance spraviti na to, o čemer vrsto let govorimo, pa nismo naredili. To je zdaj, kar se tiče fiskusa, druge pa pol verjetno v nadaljevanju.
Gospod Székely, boste na kratko odgovorili še gospodu Mraku. Jaz bi pa samo tu še dodala vprašanje, ali so morda ta priporočila, zadnja priporočila Evropske komisije na nek način, ali se jih lahko bere tudi kot program nove vlade?
I don't think that the issue here is lack of trust. In fact, I have to say, to the extent I personally can judge this, and have been working with the administration very closely, a lot of trust has been built. It is more about giving the sense of urgency. And I cannot agree more with Professor Mrak that reforms are needed. Not because Brussels asked them, because the country needs them. And I think some of those elements are just reflecting this, and not a lack of trust, certainly not in the part of the Commission I can judge. In terms of, what should be the program for the government is elected by people. So people should tell the government what the program should be. We will be working with the government that is elected by the country, but also the fact is that Slovenia is part of the euro area, and countries that entered the euro area agreed that they will do certain things in a certain way. There is a benefit from joining this important part of the world, and there are certain obligations that come with it. And I think this is in this spirit that there are certain overarching considerations for the euro area as a whole. Again, not Slovenia per se, but euro area as a whole, because we went through a crisis. This was a defining moment in the history of the euro area. We pulled through this crisis, we learned a lot of things from this crisis, and now we would like to turn those lessons into action. And those actions are actually for everyone. I just checked, I have a little table here. In the areas where Slovenia received recommendations, almost all euro area countries received sometimes very similar recommendations. So I think, again, it's important to understand that there is a shared future of the euro area and the EU, and we all have to do our best to turn this shared future into a good one.
Hvala. Če še malce ostanemo pri proračunu, ki ga bo pač morala oblikovati nova vlada, in pri teh odhodkih, pri rezanju, gospod Vasle, kaj bi lahko rekli? Bi bilo morda smiselno, da se usmeri bolj programsko pri rezanju teh odhodkov? Gre za, kot vemo, idejo staro že nekaj let, ki je na nek način ni kupila, v narekovajih seveda nobena vlada.
To drži. Ta ideja, da bi se odhodki proračuna znižali na podlagi posameznih programov, je že zelo stara, vendar se nažalost v zadnjih letih nikoli ni uresničila. Na koncu smo leto končali pri več ali manj linearnih ukrepih, kar z druge besede pomeni, da se pač ministri med sabo niso mogli zmeniti in so potem na koncu našli tisti najnižji skupni imenovalec. Tako da seveda v prihodnje mislim, da bi bilo zelo pomembno, da se ponovno budi ta ideja programskega pristopa k proračunu in mislim tudi, da zdaj pravi čas pred formiranjem nove vlade. Namreč, ko bo enkrat vlada sestavljena, ko bodo ministrstva razdeljena, potem bo, mislim, da ministri prav čez noč posvojili ta svoje ministrstva, svoje resorje, postali bodo branitelji teh svojih novo pridobljenih interesov in potem bo mnogo težje pripraviti neko programsko idejo, shemo, katere so tista področja, ki bi lahko nekoliko bolj sistematično uredili kot v preteklosti.
Gospa Sorsa, zdi se nekoliko protislovno, boste vi pojasnili, če ni, da na nek način mora Slovenija zdaj delati konsolidacijo na odhodkovni strani, torej na rezanju, po drugi strani se v številnih državah Evropske unije krepi prepričanje, da je drastično rezanje na odhodkih škodljivo za gospodarsko aktivnost. Kje bi po vašem mnenju lahko Slovenija našla ravnotežje med tema dvema zadevama, ker vemo, treba bo varčevati in treba bo investirati? Skratka, vprašanje za $1 milijon.
If I knew the answer, I'd be here making the millions. But anyway, if you look at spending in any country, you can always identify pro-growth spending or efficient spending and cut somewhere, where things are less efficient. And at the OECD, we tend to tell countries, especially, protecting certain investments. Also, active labor market policies are very important because that's how you get people to jobs, and then that helps the economy. Or then you can, pension or health spending, these are longer-term reforms, but, you can look there. And I don't know well enough the Slovenian budget, but I'm sure, if you really look, there's always ways to save, and, then it's important also to protect certain spending for growth and even social programs.
Gospod Marković, zdaj smo slišali, kaj nam je storiti, pravzaprav že nekaj let zapored vemo, kaj nam je storiti, a zgodi se malo oziroma premalo. Če nas lahko primerjate z ostalimi državami, ker vem, da ste zadolženi za več držav, ne samo za našo, kaj je po vašem mnenju razlog, da se od teh načrtov, ki so na nek način pravilni, gredo v pravo smer, potem ne realizira? Tipičen primer je recimo privatizacija.
Well, there are good examples where Slovenia is leader in some fields. I mean, the issues that we discuss here today, and that's corporate restructuring as a consequence of NPL resolution, non-performing loan resolution, it's not even on radar of many of the countries in the region. Many of the countries would have very high NPLs, yet still didn't come to the stage when they have active plans in how to do accompanying corporate restructuring and resolve the NPLs. So I would look at... I'm very positive on Slovenia, right? I mean, I would look at Slovenia as a really a good example. It's just, like whether we persevere down the line, whether we do everything that we started. I mean, the commitment on the privatization is there. We have the list of 15 corporates. We started it. The commitment on corporate structuring is there. We have the bank asset management company. We are thinking how to do the restructuring of the remaining NPLs. The only thing is, right, I mean, there are some delays in the process. So we expected to have the list of strategic companies, so above and beyond the sort of 15 companies for privatization. It'll come in due time. I hope sooner rather than later. I hope not too restrictive list in terms of the strategic companies. We also have to see some early success stories in corporate restructuring. The sooner the better. One thing that we saw when the credibility of government actually improved and the cost of funding fell is that at the beginning especially, everyone was willing to lend to Slovenia, but not many were willing to invest in Slovenia. So we slowly have to come to the stage where actually we have more equity in the core, and to attract the fresh capital, we will have to see, like some early good stories about corporate structuring as well that'll accelerate the process for the rest of the companies as well. So again, coming back, like to my thing, I think we are on a good track, in many respects ahead of other countries in the region. But we have to do it faster and we have to persevere on the track and should definitely not backtrack on the commitments already made.
Gospa Sorsa.
If I just may add here that the risks of not pursuing the reforms now can be actually quite high. István already mentioned that Slovenia is entering sort of a vulnerability zone with the debt. And for example, if the markets start to perceive that reforms are not being done, your spread can go up very quickly. And it's pretty low now. And if that's going to, again, affect your fiscal balances because interest payments are already like 3% of GDP. And if there's not reform done, this can come through the markets that all of a sudden you pay more for interest and that's going to affect public finances and so on. So in that sense, I think it's quite important now to pursue the reforms also.
Gospod Kraan, bi se vi bolj strinjali z gospodom Markovičem ali z gospod Sorso? Skratka, vi vidite stvari bolj optimistično, saj glede privatizacije, kot je naštel gospod Markovič, ali morda bi tudi vi se pridružili gospe Sorsi pri tem opozarjanju na vse to, kaj Slovenija še mora storiti, da se ne bomo spet znašli v situaciji, ko je bil naš donos, na primer, na obveznice vrtoglav.
Well, I'm not an expert on privatization. I do know, of course, that privatization is an excellent policy to reduce the public debt. I mean, that's not only true for Slovenia, but it's true for many OECD countries and IMF countries that there is still enormous potential for privatization that will reduce the public debt and that will reduce the interest payments, and that's in this way also very good for the public budget. I want to make one additional remark about somebody who said or you said it yourself, that none of the political parties in the Slovenian election had paid any attention to economic consequences of fiscal policy. I think in this respect, Slovenia has a certain advantage. That's true, of course, in many countries. But in this respect, Slovenia has an advantage vis-à-vis other countries in that it is blessed with the existence of IMAT. Not many countries have a Bureau of Economic Analysis that does independent forecasting, that can publish its studies, and that can independently from the government describe what the consequences of fiscal and fiscal policy will be, and economic policy in general. But I do think that this advantage in principle is not fully used in Slovenia. I think IMAT can be used much more effectively if it was asked not only to do the macroeconomic forecasts, but also to advise the government, also now the new government that will come into office in the next few weeks, on the economic consequences of its policies. I mean, similar institutions IMAT exist in other countries. In my own country, to begin with, my own country is the Netherlands, and we have this planning bureau. Well, planning bureau is a misnomer because it's not a planning bureau at all. It's a forecasting bureau. But anyway, it sits often at the table of the government and advises the government about the economic consequences of its policies. And that, I think, is very essential, not only for the government itself, but also to change this, what I earlier called cultural setting, in which the government has to pay more attention to budgetary discipline. So I would say that it would be very important reform for Slovenia to make more use of IMAT and to ask IMAT to advise on all its major economic and fiscal policies, to begin with the annual fiscal strategy.
Ja, izvolite, gospod Mrak.
Dirk opened this question. It works? Okay. Yeah. Since Dirk opened this question, I would say I would very much agree that UMAR, I'll go to Slovin, da bi imel urad dejansko pri teh stvareh večjo vlogo. Ne pozabiti, mi imamo urad za makroekonomske analize in razvoj. Verjetno veste, kdo je delal strategijo razvoja Republike Slovenije, draftiral. Ministrstvo za ekonomijo, linijsko ministrstvo. Se pravi, mi imamo sistemske probleme, kako določene stvari delamo. Imamo po mojem inštitucijo, kot je bilo rečeno, praktično ena redkih držav, ki imamo to vrstno inštitucijo, v precej državah, jaz v to regijo našo precej dobro poznam, so te makroekonomske stvari delane kar v Ministrstvu za finance. Jaz mislim, da je to zelo dobro, da so delane tako, kot so pri nas, ampak se mi zdi, da bi bilo dejansko ta del, ki se tiče zadnje črke razvoja, moral biti bistveno bolj sistematično koriščen, ker je tudi potencial kadrovski v tej inštituciji, glede na to, kar imamo v vladi, mnogo večji. Tako pa ta del razvoja, ampak ko govorimo o razvoju, govorimo tudi o strategiji razvoja. V vsaki vladi en minister malo vzame. Spomnite se vlade predsednika Janše, je bil to Jože Damjan, pa je bilo potem Gasparjevo ministrstvo, vsi so imeli nek razvoj. In to je problem, to je po mojem problem tega tipa koalicijskih vlad, tazga, kot ga imamo, ne more imeti razvoja, koordinirati inštitucija, ki ni horizontalna. In mi jo imamo, tako da po mojem bilo treba ene stvari vrniti nazaj, kjer so že bile. Strategije razvoja v Sloveniji smo jasno delali na UMAR-ju vrstokrat in so bile več ali manj zelo korektno delane in je bilo tudi v bistvu ta link pol do premijeja je zelo jasen. Tako da, ja, se zelo strinjam s tem.
Gospod Vasle, se strinjate s tem predlogom, ki smo ga pravkar slišali od gospoda Mraka? Verjetno težko vprašanje za vas, pa vseeno, ravno zato.
Glede na to, s katere institucije prihajam, se seveda strinjam s tem in res mislim, da imamo v Sloveniji bolj kot, ko poslušamo različne debate oziroma različne ideje o tem, kaj moramo narediti, kako moramo narediti, bolj problem tega kulture dialoga oziroma politične kulture, kot pa da bi imeli problem s samim raziskavami. Ko ste videli danes za tem omizjem, se praktično vsi strinjamo in glede tega, kaj je treba narediti. Imamo tudi zelo podobne poglede na to, s katerimi ukrepi, na kakšen način te stvari izpeljati, ampak potem na koncu se pa prelomi pri tej povezavi med idejami, med dokumenti, ki jih pripravljamo, javno objavljamo in predstavljamo in potem, kaj se na koncu, kako na koncu poteka debata v teh formalnih institucijah, pa ne mislim tukaj samo na vlado, tudi naprimer institut socialnega dialoga, socialnega partnerstva, kjer se vse prepogosto razpravlja o temah, ki so v bistvu faktografsko jasne, ne pa v rešitvah.
Jaz bi tu nadaljevala z temo, ki ste jo pravzaprav že omenili vsi, privatizacijo. Gospod Marković, vi prihajate iz Evropske banke za obnovo in razvoj. Pred 2 mesecama ste v Ljubljani nekaj takega odprli vnovič pisarno svojo in takrat ste izrazili upanje, da bo to pomagalo pri povečevanju obsega poslovanja v Sloveniji. Nas lahko že razveselite s kakšnimi konkretnimi novimi investicijami, ki jih boste financirali oziroma sofinancirali?
Well, we have a right person in the audience, the head of the office, our banker, Ms. Jolanta Gabriel, to answer this question and maybe add up if I miss something. We are certainly involved in a range of negotiations. It's in the process. The more structured investment, the more time it requires. We are looking at the range of opportunities in various sectors, corporate sector, but also financial industry. In due time that will result in real investments, which is why we are here.
Morda lahko malce več poveste, recimo po kakšnem ključu boste izbirali projekte, ki jih boste financirali, koliko denarja boste vložili, imate kakšen budžet recimo za letos, za prihodnje leto, koliko denarja boste vložili v Slovenijo?
Well, in principle, there is no annual limit. I mean, we can invest if there are opportunities, right? I mean, for investment and with a proper program, right? I mean, a substantial sum of money in Slovenia. So we are not limited by certain, budgets that, we are an institution that sort of commands, a budget large enough to fulfill the need, if, of course, opportunities are around. But for us to invest, of course, we have to be convinced that first, it's a sound banking story behind the project. It's a viable project. But a second, we have two more important things which drive our investment. One, something that we call transition impact, and that's how much additional value to the economy, market economy and society our projects will bring about, right? I'll give you one example. Apart from the financial industry and corporate restructuring, one of the major themes in our strategy is energy efficiency. So anything which will increase energy security, increase energy efficiency, important for the society, is also an important driver of our projects. And the third important bit is something we call, again, additionality. It's an internal slang, but what it means is that we are not here to crowd out private capital, and we are very cautious about that. Actually, for $1 of EBRD investment, we find out $2.2 of other co-investors, private co-investors, to co-invest with us in our projects. We are rarely a majority investor in a project. But us being here and us being interested in a corporate means that we will go around and find other investors who will co-invest with us, which actually increases the quality of the investment and the shareholding in any of the companies.
V tem kontekstu potem je lahko pričakovati tudi vaš vstop morda v družbo za upravljanje terjatev bank ali v kakšno drugo banko. Vemo, v nekaterih slovenskih bankah ste že bili, pa ste se potem umaknili.
We are present on the ground. We are certainly looking at all of these opportunities, and if there is a proper opportunity, we will be in. I can't discuss the exact project, but certainly, all of that is on the table and on the radar.
Razumem. Gospa Sorsa, govorimo o privatizaciji. Na nek način se zdi, da je to tudi predlog, ki ga pač vi predlagate, tudi zato, ker na nek način se ubijata dve muhi. Po eni strani, kot smo slišali, se vpliva pozitivno na javne finance, se znižuje dolg in tako naprej. Po drugi strani se pomaga pri razdolževanju gospodarstva. Vemo, v Sloveniji je slovensko gospodarstvo eno izmed bolj prezadolženih in je v bistvu vstop novega lastniškega kapitala nujen. In s tem verjetno tudi privatizacija.
Yeah, that's right. That's one way to attract this much needed equity capital to the economy. And our studies and many others have also shown that FDI has even more advantages to a country. It can promote innovation, new techniques and all that, so you can have an additional boost to productivity also with having foreign players or access to markets, access to financing. There can be many benefits.
Gospod Székely, tako Evropska komisija kot OECD pa še katere druge organizacije, institucije zapored Sloveniji priporočajo privatizacijo. V čem bi vi ocenili, da je Slovenija drugačna oziroma da je nekako bolj zaprta, da se nam bolj zatika kot morda v drugih državah? Zakaj stvari ne potekajo tako gladko kot drugje?
I think one special thing about Slovenia, and as it was pointed out in our in-depth review this year, and in fact even more last year, that you have a relatively large part of the economy which is directly or indirectly controlled by state and has a very complex ownership structure with cross-ownerships and relationships that are not always very conducive to the growth of these companies and the well-functioning of these companies. And it's certainly a factor that can make FDI actually somewhat less likely to happen. So I think we gave a very detailed analysis of this sector. And for us, the number one thing is honestly not privatization per se. Privatization in itself is not a goal. What is the goal here and what is the important thing for a country is to make sure that this part of the economy contributes to the economy and society and contributes as much as the rest. And if you look into the functioning of this part, this is the part which is heavily indebted. Some of these charts in the morning, I think there was an excellent presentation on this. These are exactly those companies that are having a very high level of indebtedness. These are the companies that have problem with meeting their payment obligations. These are the companies that cannot invest. These are the companies that cannot create new jobs. So these are the companies that are not contributing to society as much as the others. So I think for us this is the number one problem, and this is the number one task or challenge to be met. All the rest is just how we get there. And again, as we many times emphasized, and it is on our country-specific recommendations, what we first ask is for the political level, the elected representative of the people, to decide which way they want to go. So the strategy for the state holding. Once that is done, then it's for those professionals to execute this. If it is privatization, if that was the political decision, like the list of 15s, do a good job in privatization. Privatization in itself doesn't guarantee anything. Good privatization guarantees good outcomes, or at least makes it more likely to happen. Badly executed privatization creates problems. I think that's the experience of the region for many years. So again, what we are asking for is good privatization, and how we can ensure that the privatization is good. We create an institutional culture, an institution which is professional, which has a mandate and has no other job than to do a good privatization. And the same applies to the other part of the state holding, which is there to maintain those companies that remain state-owned. Just look into what is the return on their equity. Just look into how many good new jobs they created. We had excellent charts in the morning showing us in very rich details of how these companies are inhibited from doing what you expect from a good company to do. So again, what is the job here? The job here is to improve the functioning of these companies. How do we achieve that? We achieve that by setting up a transparent, clear system where the political level makes the political decision and the technical level does the technical job, and everybody does a good job. So political level makes a decision that people are in agreement with, it expresses their preferences, and the technical level does a job, what is their mandate that is given by the political level. And there are very well-known ways of creating good institutions, in this case a good state holding, and there are excellent examples around Europe of good state holdings, and those good state holdings actually deliver results. So you see all of a sudden companies there that are state-owned but actually are absolutely competitive on the world scene, and we can give you very good examples. So again, there is no ideology behind this. What is behind this is the need for the country to have well-functioning economy.
Skratka, privatizacija ni cilj, cilj je dobro upravljeno podjetje, dobičkonosno podjetje. Gospod Mrak, vi ste še želeli, jaz bi morda tu samo še dodala, da ti privatizacijski procesi morajo potekati tudi transparentno in tekoče. Zdaj mi imamo res v Sloveniji kar nekaj takih, kako bi rekla, neprijetnih izkušenj s to privatizacijo. Ravno za zadnjo je poskrbela predsednica vlade v odhodu, ko je v bistvu na nek način ustavila proces privatizacije, dokler pač se ne formira nova vlada. Tu ne gre za dobre signale, gospod Mrak.
Ja, jaz se zavedam, da smo 3 dni pred volitvami, pa tudi s takimi stvarmi mislim, da jaz mislim, da to, kar sem jaz že rekel, jaz mislim, da en velik problem, ki ga imamo v Sloveniji, je kredibilnost. In za stvari, ki jih enkrat sprejme vlada in potrdi državni zbor, potem take stvari bi potem morale držati. Tako da, kar se mene tiče, teh 15 firm bi moralo jeti po procesu, kot je bil dogovorjen, in tle volitve ja, ne bi smele vplivati. A so zdaj ta prave firme tam noter, ja ali ne? Jaz mislim, da ne. Ampak so. V eni fazi so bile dogovorjene. Kako so bile dane v tisti paket skup, jaz mislim, da noben ne ve čisto dober. Kakšna je bila logika? Ampak da grem nazaj, zelo veliko tle je bilo govora o dobrem upravljanju, pa o dobri privatizaciji. Tle imamo mi problem. Kaj je to dobro? Problem, ki ga imamo v Sloveniji, je, da vidimo, da v bistvu, žal, se je pokazalo, da za državnim premoženjem smo slabo upravljali. In ena od stvari, ki jih ta privatizacija nosi, je to, kar se dostikrat pogovarjamo o tem, da bo zmanjšala javni dolg. Ampak druga stvar, ki pa dosti ne govorimo, je pa tudi ta, da da je to tudi en način, da ne bomo jutri ponovno plačevali za nekaj, kar je še vedno v državni lasti, ker očitno imamo probleme z upravljanjem. Načelno je pa res. Ne? Upravljanje, se pravi tudi državna podjetja, ne, lahko delajo dobro, ne, načelno, ampak pri nas ne. Ne. Pri nas v principu ne delajo dobro. Ne. Zelo malo jih je. In zdaj, če pogledamo tole, kar bomo imeli na volitvah, bo ta zgodba. Ne. Ena in drugo lastništvo je kar se tega enako, ampak izkušnje kažejo, da s tem ne znamo upravljati. In če ne znamo, dajmo poraj zmanjšati škodo, ki jo bomo naredili, ker si bomo drugače še enkrat v bistvu javne finance uničili. Ne. Zdaj v tem kontekstu bi se pa tudi jasno, ne, privatizacija, ki imamo takoj potem tuje investicije, vemo, kakšen je ta naš odnos. Jaz moram reči, da ko sem slišal, da se EBRD vrača v Slovenijo, ne, danes sem imel zelo mešane občutke. Ne. Po eni strani je to absolutno dobro, zaradi tega, ker vidimo, da v bistvu imamo probleme in s pritegnitvijo tujih investicij in se mi zdi, da je to lahko zelo pozitiven, zlasti v tem kontekstu kreiranja nekega okolja. Ne. Po drugi strani pa bodimo si odkriti. Ne. To v bistvu kaže, da smo stvari slabo pelali. Ne. Banka je iz Slovenije odšla, ker ni bila več potrebna in se je morala vrniti. Prosim, da ne je bilo narobe razumljeno, ni nikakršna kritika banke. Jaz mislim, da je dobro to. Ne? Ampak moramo vedeti, da v bistvu je banka prišla zdaj, ne, tudi dobro na našo prošnjo, ampak zakaj? Ker v bistvu rabimo tudi ta kanal, da bomo stimulirali neko dodatno komfort tu investitorjem, da bo prišla. Ne? Tako da, pravim, večkrat sem imel tako osebno malo dilemo, kaj človek pri taki stvari reči. Ne? Banka praktično končuje svojo kariero kot banka za tranzicijske države, ne, končno, ne, odkar dela v Turčiji. Jaz mislim, da zelo težko še govorimo, da je to banka Bank for Transition Economies, ampak postaja to klasična regionalna razvojna banka, kot so interameriška, afriška in tako dalje. Tako da jaz želim banki in jasno, preko tega tudi jasno, da nam bo nam kaj pomagala, veliko uspeha pri ponovnem zagonu posla v Sloveniji.
Gospod Kren, mislim, da ste vi želeli še nekaj dodati.
I wanted to make one remark on the grey area that exists in Slovenia between the market and the government. Mr. Székely and Mr. Mar has talked about the public enterprises which are at the market side of this grey area. But there is also a government side of this grey area. It's called the so-called indirect budget users. There are 300 indirect budget users in Slovenia. I mean, you have to think of schools, musea, hospitals, social service providers. And there are 1,000 indirect budget users at the local level, so that have the same relationship to the municipality. And all these indirect budget users to a substantial extent escape the standards of operational management that are in force for the ministries, the so-called direct budget users. And there are many, in other countries, there are of course also so-called agencies. I've understood that Slovenia particularly appeals in discussions about this to the agencies in Sweden. Indeed, in Sweden there are some 400 agencies where 96% of public employees work. So the government is the ministries is only 4% of employment of the central government. And this example is sometimes appealed to when we have discussions with officials of Slovenia. But then it's forgotten that the agencies in Sweden and in several other countries where agencies are prominent, like in the UK and in the Netherlands and in Australia and Canada, it's forgotten that these agencies entirely fall under the ministerial responsibility as far as operational management is concerned, and that there is no exception to the standard, the rules of operational management of the Swedish agency or the Dutch agencies or the UK agencies with other ministries. But that's very different in Slovenia. In Slovenia, there is no let's say, steering unit as exists in all these other countries in the line ministries that have as exclusive task to see to it that the agencies are managed well, are efficient, and comply with the rules of operational management that apply to everybody else. So it would be a very important reform for Slovenia to re-establish, I would say, the responsibility of the line ministries for the indirect budget users, and to establish units within the line ministries that with the exclusive task to steer the agencies. This is nothing particular that exists in other countries, and that would be, in my view, a very important way also of realizing savings, because in Slovenia also, I believe, between 60 and 70% of public employment is in the indirect budget users. So we are talking about the largest part of the government, which escapes until now many important rules of operational management.
Torej, slišali smo še nekaj o specifičnih vidikih slovenskih proračunskih porabnikov. Jaz pa bi se, glede na to, da je že kar nekaj ura, pa da bomo skušali dati besedo tudi vam za kakšno vprašanje, na kratko dotaknila vendarle še tujega vlaganja. In sicer, gospod Marković, v Sloveniji številni imajo precej, kako bi rekla, ne preveč dobre izkušnje s tujimi vlagatelji. Res je, nekateri med njimi so tudi oklestili število zaposlenih, racionalizirali, niso se osredotočali na razvoj podjetja, in posledica tega je, da je javno mnenje to privzelo kot nevarno, kot da se pač je treba bati tujega kapitala. In posledica, kot vemo, je tudi to, da je slovensko gospodarsko okrevanje zaradi tega počasno in neprepričljivo. Kaj bi vi svetovali, kako preseči ta verjetno nerazumni strah?
Thank you very much for the question. Let me just quickly address Professor Mrak's suggestion about EBRD's return here. EBRD indeed, operates in a range of countries, many of them early transition countries. But we do operate in many advanced transition countries, Poland, Slovakia, Slovenia. I would look at EBRD's return, reopening the office in Slovenia in another context. We are much more active in countries where we see the dedication and national consensus about reforms. So we were invited by the government, but we also would hardly decide to reopen the office if we didn't believe that the national consensus has built up. Over the 5 years when we did have the office, we kept investing in Slovenia, but reopening means that given the reform context, we believe that that will intensify in the future. So that's really the context of returning rather than the lack of success, right? In terms of the FDI, that's not the dilemma only in Slovenia, it's a dilemma in many countries. Many countries would fear that foreign direct investment also means that profit will be sucked out of the country. But what's the alternative? To close the border? Foreign investors do not bring only a potential for some profit to go out, they also bring a different knowledge. They bring improvement in corporate governance. If you look at other countries, don't look at Slovenia, but look at other countries' banking sector and compare foreign-owned, partially foreign-owned or domestic-owned, you can often see that the way corporate governance is structured in foreign-owned companies is much better. Foreign-owned companies seem to be at least much less prone to corruption than domestically owned companies or banks in other countries. So there are some improvements, and I would actually point out that despite some risks being created, it's always like that, the benefits are overwhelming in terms of the improvements in knowledge, governance, in terms of the improvements in R&D, and ultimately competitiveness of the country.
Še zadnje vprašanje, gospe Sorsa, glede na to, da je edina dama med nami. Torej, kako preseči ta iracionalni strah pred tujimi vlagatelji? Vi imate verjetno izkušnje s temi zadevami.
Well, one way to deal with this is to bring success stories from other countries or, good experiences and things like that. But I would to reinforce what you said, that is there any choice? You also said that you have bad experience with state companies. We want jobs, we want people want salaries, they want a better life. So maybe one should present these foreign investors as partners in the society. And partly you can also influence a bit how they behave in your country, how you set up the business environment. Because it depends, on taxation rules or what they can do or environmental regulations. You can make them responsible social citizens of your country. So in that sense, of course, they always try to go around some of them. Like at the OECD, we have what we call BEPS. It's trying to make sure that, they actually pay taxes in a country and behave there. But I think it's up to also Slovenia to set up the framework so that you have sort of a good corporate citizens as your foreign investors.
Še kakšno vprašanje, kakšen komentar iz občinstva? Če ne, bomo končali z besedo. Dajemo še našemu gostitelju, gospodu Vasletu.
Hvala. Na koncu bi se želel samo najlepše zahvaliti vsem udeležencem današnje konference, vsem gostom, moderatorjem, ki ste prispevali svoje stališča, svoja mnenja, pomagali oblikovati te napotke, ki prihajajo res v občutljivem ali pa zelo pomembnem času. Vsem želim srečno pot domov, predvsem tistim bolj oddaljenim gostom pa, da bi ujeli tudi večerno tekmo. Hvala lepa.
Germany. There cannot be bigger match than this.